Hour 2 radio program on your Friday. It's the 23rd day of February. We wanted to do this. We thought of this yesterday. It took us a day or so to sort of line up the right spot, and we were thinking about doing a couple of them as we look back at the women's hockey game yesterday or 2 days ago in South Korea when they won in the shootout. We figured that we go back and look 38 years ago at the USA game against Russia, which obviously was an Armageddon game, and the United States in that win, 5-3, came back 2 days later to beat Finland. And we wanted to find the right person who could help us. We think we did find that person. He's a good man. He's been part of the ABC Sports Foundation forever. He's retired now in Florida. He's Dennis Lewin. Dennis, long time no talk. Christopher Russo, how are you today, pal?
Hi, Chris. How are you? Good to be with you.
Good to have you aboard, Dan. Dan, what was your assignment in 1980? What were you doing? What was the assignment you had for ABC Sports?
Well, I had a couple of titles at that point. I was a senior producer of the Olympics, and I was also producing the figure skating up there at Lake Placid. But when I wasn't producing the figure skating, I was in the studio next to my boss, Ron Arledge, helping put things on the air. So I had a bunch of different hats I was wearing at the time.
All right, that is just the Olympics. Were you doing Monday Night Football at the time? What were you doing with Monday Night Football?
I had done the 1979 season of Monday Night Football, and that was the last season I actually produced it. I produced it 6 or 7 years in the 70s, ending with 79.
All right,
and then, as you know,
right.
From 1986 to 96, I was the head of production for ABC Sports, so I oversaw all our production.
You sure were all over the place. All right, were you in Munich in '72 then, or no?
Yes, I was.
Were you there?
I produced in Munich. I produced, I guess you would call it the Mark Spitz show, and I really had nothing to do with covering the incredible tragedy that occurred there, other than sitting in the studio with Ron all day. But I really was not working on that at all.
Well, let's do that.
And I also produced the infamous U.S.-USSR basketball game in Munich when the Americans lost for the first time.
You're perfect, then. A couple things. Let's first do.
I don't know if I'm perfect, Chris.
No, you're perfect to talk about what I like to talk about right now. Let's first talk '72 Munich. I know Rune made the call with McKay over Cosell. I don't know if Cosell was a close decision. McKay seemed to make the most sense. Talk about that for a second, and the decision by Arledge to go with McKay to break the news to America and cover that story instead of anybody else, whether it's Cosell or another person who worked for ABC.
Well, it was really Rune's decision and Rune's decision solely, and he really felt, I guess, and I never had ever discussed it with him before or after, and I worked with Rune for 20 years. But I'm sure what he felt was that Jim, through his years as a journalist and through his sensitivity and approach to journalism, would be the ideal guy to do it. And with all his experience in and around the wide world of sports shows, Jim was so well-rounded and so human. I think he was felt he was the right guy to handle the experience, and obviously he turned out to be very right.
And he made that decision right, on that, whatever that morning was. He made that decision to call Jim to come to the studio that morning, correct?
He did, and you know what, Chris? I wasn't there when the decision was made. By the time I got to the studio, they were already in place. So I really can't speak to the decision other than to say Rune made the right call.
All right. Well, is it true that Cosell raised hell that he wasn't chosen to do the job?
Chris, if he did, I wasn't there. I would tell you if I heard it personally, but I never heard it personally. I've heard a lot of other people say he was very unhappy about it. In all the years I worked with Howard, and I worked with Howard for 20 years, he never mentioned it to me.
Never, all right? And I know Howard is difficult, so he doesn't get the benefit of the doubt on that, but you never heard it, so that tells me something.
I never heard it.
All right, let's do the basketball game now. That was a Saturday night, I believe, following the tragedy, and I think Gifford had the play-by-play. Is that correct?
It was. Frank was the play-by-play, and Bill Russell was our color.
Oh, Bill Russell did that. Oh, I didn't realize that Russell called that. Wow.
And everybody expected, hey, the U.S. is going to win. We'd always won it. And with about 3 minutes to go in the game, or 5 minutes to go, I can't tell you exactly what it was anymore, but the Americans looked like they had it. I sent Bill Russell to the locker room to do a winter interview with Hank Iba. So Bill is down there alone in the winter locker room when all hell breaks loose on the court, and never saw any of it. And then when everything occurred and the team went back in there and he had to do the interview with Iba, he really didn't know what happened, and I was trying to talk him through it, which was almost impossible.
Wow. So you sent Russell down to talk to Iba, and like today, that wouldn't happen because today you'd have an on the field reporter.
You probably would, but again, the expectation of that game was no contest.
Right, although we were down a lot in that game. All right,
yep.
Did that game? Now that happened after the massacre?
Yes, it did. It was almost the end of the games.
It was like the last couple of days.
Yes.
Did that game lose all its? I know historically it's had tremendous furor, but there in person, did it have as much of an outcry based on what just had occurred? Were that many folks that wrapped up in it at the time or not?
Yes.
Oh, they were.
You know, you're asking a guy that was right in the middle of it as having produced the telecast. And yeah, there was a huge outroar. I mean, we had people storming into our studio wanting to see the tapes, wanting to see what actually happened, and we just said, let us do our own show. And the reality was that when the game ended, I was supposed to go back to the studio because we were on tape. Because of the time
that game was at night.
In Munich, we were showing that game on tape.
Yeah, that game was shown.
Go back. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know that game was shown on a Saturday night, so that game was about a 4 or 5 hour tape. Good point. Yes.
And I was supposed to go back to the studio to edit it down to whatever time Roon wanted for it to play it, in the telecast. And because we never knew what was going to happen on the site, I stayed there, and Roon kept saying, when are you coming back? And I said, Roon, you better start editing it because I don't know when I'll be back. I don't know when a final decision will be made. And Frank Gifford and I and the Soviet basketball team stayed in the arena until about 4 o'clock in the morning alone, and everybody else left.
Well, how long did it take them to make a final decision on the outcome of that game? It took 3 or 4 hours?
No, they really had made it. What really happened is they all just left. And the final decision had really been made. It was the head of FIBA at the time, and I can't remember his name, Chris, but he was the guy that came running down to the scorer's table that kept telling him to reset the clock. So the decision had already been made.
Right, okay, but stayed there.
We didn't know. We weren't going to leave until everybody else left, and the Russians were still sitting there.
Just in case they got called back and everything
Correct.
else. Okay, now let's move ahead now. And what a job Bill Russell didn't know what was going on. One of the great games in history, one of the most controversial finishes in history of basketball.
Exactly, and Russell, because we didn't have a monitor in there for him to see it. He didn't have anything.
Yeah.
And it was, I was trying to talk him through the whole thing after it was over. It was not pretty.
Dennis Lewin thoughts. All right, let's talk about the 80 in Lake Placid. First off, Lake Placid itself as a Winter Olympics site, was it cramped? Was the buildings good?
It was good. It was a wonderful site. It absolutely was a wonderful site, and it was a wonderful Olympics. The reality is that it lived up to everything it promised to be.
It did. So it was a perfect. I mean, were there enough hotel rooms and all those kinds of things for you guys to hang out?
Sure. Look, the reality was, again, when you're sitting there producing it, you don't know what problems might be existing in hotel rooms because you don't have that issue. So might there have been a problem with hotel rooms? My guess is the answer is yes. My guess is people were driving in from faraway places, but I never heard any complaining about it being there.
All right. Now, Michaels and Dryden, had they ever worked before that Olympiad or no? They had not.
No. I was the one who put Al onto the hockey telecast. I was one of my jobs. Chuck Howard and I were sort of splitting the responsibilities for overseeing different venues, and one of mine was hockey. And when we talked about announcer assignments, I said I wanted Al to do the hockey, and Al ended up doing the hockey. And then we hired Kenny Dryden to do it, and it turned out to be a perfect pairing.
Oh, it sure did. Did they do any games prior to that Olympiad where they got their feet wet, or did they just basically start that week to do the games?
My recollection is they just started that week to do the games. Now, I could be wrong on that, Chris. We're talking a long time ago, but my recollection was they just started doing the games. And what we had done is Chet Forty, and you remember Chet.
Oh, and I remember Chuck Howard, too. I remember both of them. Go ahead.
Chet was the producer on site for the hockey, and we had hired the Hockey Night in Canada guys from Canada, Ronnie Harrison and Ralph Mellenby, to help us with the world feed, because we were responsible for the world feed, not just the U.S. feed.
I see.
And so the pictures, the world pictures were being done by Ronnie Harrison and Ralph Mellenby, and then Chet was producing it for the United States.
All right, did you get right? I mean, were they a huge story? Did Lewin say we got to keep an eye on this team? This is a huge story. Who knows how they're going to do? Or was it a story that kind of developed?
Chris,
go ahead.
Much as what I said to you in reverse about the American basketball team, this was the reverse. Nobody expected the American hockey team to get where they got to. As a matter of fact, neither did the Olympic Committee, because we had a deal that if the Americans made it into the Friday semifinals, they would play that game in prime time for us. And they readily made the deal, probably never expecting it could ever occur. And then all of a sudden, when it did occur, and all of a sudden the Americans were in the game against the Soviets to play on Friday, they reneged on their agreement with us to play it in prime time for us because the Russians wanted it played later, so it met more with their time zones, which, if I remember right, was an 8-hour time difference.
Wow, I do. That was going to be my next deal. So that you had made a deal with the Olympic Committee to put the game in prime time. You're right. Russia, at 4:30 in the afternoon. I think it's a 7-hour time difference. At least you can watch it in Russia. It's late at night, but you can watch it. So you got burned on that. Well, couldn't you fight? I mean, the Olympics are this is our country. We
fought, but we lost. There was no, the International Hockey Federation and the Olympic Committee said, nope, this is the way we're going to do it. So
wow.
They played the game at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and what few people in this country remember is we showed it on videotape.
Oh, I remember. We're going to get to that in a minute. What was the other? So Finland played in the other semifinal game. What time did they play the game? Do you know there, Dennis? They play at night, 8 o'clock?
Yeah, well, they must have played at 8 o'clock.
So they played the back-to-back games, and
right.
So as the U.S. is advancing, you're probably pounding that IOC Olympic Hockey Committee every 5 minutes. Hey, guys, they're a game away. Don't let me play this game at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, correct?
You know what? There was no reason to pound them because we had been told it was going to happen.
Oh, that's correct. Okay.
And the reality is, since we had been told it was happening, we had no reason to pound them because it was going to happen.
Well, when did they
happen until it happened?
Well, when did they change it? That morning or the day?
No,
before?
They changed it when the two teams finally got there. I guess it was 2 days before. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember the schedule off the top of my head, but I think they had a day off between the games.
Right. I'm sure they did. Yeah. Now
so it was probably, on Thursday morning or something, they changed it because the other game was probably Wednesday night because it was a Friday night that the game occurred, Friday afternoon.
Right.
That the game occurred.
Now, how much was there by the time they got to that game? I know they had the game against Czechoslovakia and everything else, and I remember that game. They came back. Yep. When did you start to notice a build-up for excitement for the team?
To be honest with you, it really wasn't until the 2 days before, until the reality suddenly hit. Hey, they're really going to the semifinals.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah, really, honest. I'm not sure we had shown much hockey up until that point.
Oh, really? Wow.
I mean, I'd have to go back. You'd have to go back and check it. Again, I'm doing it from memory. But my recollection is that, we might have shown 20 minutes of it here, 30 minutes of it there, but certainly not showing big chunks of it.
All right, now let's talk about how much coverage there was. Now it's wall to wall. You can't get away from it. Back in those days, in '80, now it's in America. It's at a good time difference, a good time scenario. It's in Lake Placid. We're good. Now, there was no boycott. I mean, but Russia's the enemy, like the summer games. How much did ABC do 5 hours a night of coverage? How much coverage did you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Basically, it was primetime only.
So
basically, other than weekends, we were basically prime time only in 1980.
So it was 8 to 11 every night. That was it.
Yes.
And McKay was the host, correct?
Jim was the host, correct.
Now, why?
Jim also did the figure skating from the studio with Dick Button on site, which was a different story. But Jim was the host.
Wow, I didn't. So McKay did who won the gold medal in figure skating that year? I don't even know who won.
I got to remember. Linda Fradiani ended up runner-up. It may have been Katerina Witt. I don't remember anymore.
All right, so it wasn't an American. So let me get this
Linda
straight.
Fradiani lost barely getting the gold medal in figure skating, in the ladies figure skating, and it was after that they changed the rules, and had the rules been in effect when she skated, she would have won.
I vaguely remember that, but Jim was not in the arena.
Jim was not in the arena. Jim was back in our control studio, and Dick Button was on site with Peggy Fleming.
Well, why wouldn't they get a play-by-play person who could host it and have Jim stay in the studio? Why didn't they have just get somebody else?
Well, again, you'd have to ask Ruin, and unfortunately he's gone. But I think Ruin's feeling on it was Jim had been our figure skating guy for years and years and years. And rather than putting somebody else on it to suddenly do the Olympics, he felt he could get the best of both worlds by having Jim handle it in the studio. But our analysts were on site, so the people actually analyzing what was occurring were on site.
That's very strange. Dennis Lewin doing a tremendous job. Okay, now, was there a decision that when you did not get it live, the U.S. game live, was there any consideration of doing the game live at 5 o'clock instead of showing it on tape delay?
My recollection is there was some discussion of it, but again, the feeling was the Americans were not going to win, and it was going to end up being, 20 minutes of coverage, 30 minutes of coverage. And in those days, to a large degree, the news department held sway, and the news department didn't want to get preempted for the Olympic coverage of a hockey game where they thought the Americans probably weren't going to win anyway.
Despite the fact that the Olympics was probably doing very well rating-wise on a night-to-night basis, right?
And it was. But, again, you've got, I'm not trying to defend the news department. By the way, the news department was being run by Roone Arledge at the time, in addition to sports.
Wow, yes.
So he was wearing both hats. So at the end of the day, the decision was to stick with the 8 o'clock time period, show highlights of it on tape, and that's the way we were going to go.
Wow! So Roone, if Roone wanted
you got to put it in perspective, Chris, because nobody even remotely considered the Americans, who were made up of a bunch of college kids, to beat the Soviets, who were really a bunch of professionals.
That is true, Den. But I was in college. I was a sophomore at college at the time, and that is accurate. But I remember where I was at Rollins, that game was a much anticipated game. It wasn't like it's a hot game tonight. We all had followed that, and that was a good Olympiad anyway, as you just mentioned. A lot of things are happening in the Olympics, so there was a lot of attention to it. We all were looking forward to that game. So this is not a situation where it kind of just dawned on us, oh, look at this, they got a game tonight. We were prepared on a Friday night to watch it. That's the one thing I would say. That game had some hype.
We were prepared on a Friday night to show it, but we had to show it if we went live at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the West Coast, 5 o'clock in the East Coast.
Right. So
and the decision was made as a combination of news and having it on around the country in the afternoon when people were working probably didn't make sense.
Yeah, I guess so. Now, the one thing that always bothered me, Danny, and I want you to help me out here. Frank Reynolds went on and basically said, you're not going to want to miss this. Jim went on with 9 million Americans behind him with the American flag. Yep. If you tried to stay away from a score, which I remember I tried to do, if you tried to, because the game was 3 hours, there's a delay of 3 hours. If you try to stay away from a score and you put ABC on at 7:30, 7:45, whatever it might be, you were burned. Because based on the enthusiasm of the anchors, you knew that the U.S. had won the game. What's your take on that?
You want the irony on that, Chris, in all honesty?
Please. I do.
I think we got burned in a good way. I think the fact that everybody knew the Americans had pulled off this huge upset created a bigger audience for us than vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. I mean,
it became a story. People were never expecting that in a million years, and it became, at least at that point, if not to today, arguably the biggest upset in the history of sports.
I agree. So, in other words, then you think...
By the way, can I make one comment on my own comment?
Yeah, sure can. Let me hear it.
It's the nature of the medium that, to some degree, that made it that way, because people forget we did the same thing in 1960, and it just didn't get the television coverage or the media exposure that it got in 1980.
Yeah, 60. In Squaw Valley, the Americans won 1-0.
And Jack McCarthy was the goalie, and the Cleary brothers and all that, and they had the same kind of upset, but it sort of went unnoticed for 20 years.
All right. Did you do any editing? Did ABC show that game from its entirety at 8 o'clock?
1980.
Or since it was on tape, did they edit a little of it and just show? How did they handle the broadcast?
I'll tell you exactly how it worked, because I was the guy. I told you Chet Forty was producing it. Chet was on site in the truck with the announcers. Now, again, you got to go in understanding our expectation. Our expectation is the Americans aren't going to win. that we're going to show excerpts of this thing at some point, shortened highlights. So what we did is, because of one of my roles at the time was I was the coordinating producer of our Wide World of Sports show, and I'm not trying to be immodest about this, but one of my skills was editing things on the fly and shortening them down, because we often had cases in Wide World on weekends where we would have to edit things as they went along. So I was in the studio. Rune asked me to be in the studio in the tape room with it, on with Chet, who was in the truck. And what we were doing was Al and Kenny did live commentary from the start of the game to the finish. Well, what was happening is, like in the first period, they would do a segment and nothing really happened. There was a couple of face-offs. Nothing was really happening. It wasn't a whole lot of action. So I would say to Chet, I'm dumping that last 5-minute segment we did. If there's anything that Al and Kenny want to get in, such as X, Y, or Z that they had mentioned during that piece, do it again, because I'm dumping the last 5 minutes.
Wow.
So we were editing on the fly. And at the end of the first period, I don't know what we had cut out, maybe 8 or 9 minutes of it that we weren't going to use, maybe 10 minutes of it. I don't even know. I can't even tell you anymore, Chris, because we would, you get a whistle to stop play. I would tell them to lead to a commercial. It'd lead to a commercial. We might come out of it 2 face-offs later, 3 face-offs later. I can't tell you how much we cut out. But I was having them repeat things to make sure they were getting in the information they wanted to get in,
Gotcha.
that it wasn't something I was cutting out, and there was something vital to the telecast that they weren't saying.
Good point.
So we went along our merry way doing that. Well, here at the end of the first period, the game's getting pretty good. So now we go to the second period, and we're doing the same thing, but I'm taking a little less out because it's getting pretty good. And then what people forget is everybody remembers Mike Ruzione's goal. That was the play that arguably won it, along with Jim Craig. But Mark Johnson,
that was the biggest goal.
That
was the biggest goal of the game. That last goal, end of the second period, 100%. Yes.
1 second left. 1 second left, and that changed the entire game. They went late. They went the length of the ice and scored with 1 second left. They started behind their own net, and they went and they scored at the 1 second left. All of a sudden, the game's 2-2. So now the game's really good. So now we get to the third period, and the game's so good, now I'm going the other direction. Now I'm extending real time. There'd be a whistle for a face-off. I'd tell them lead to a commercial, and as soon as they were going to drop the puck, we'd pick it up there again. So now we're extending real time because we're putting commercials in but losing nothing.
Gotcha.
And so when the game ended, obviously it was great. Obviously the Americans have won. Obviously it's a great story. Rune says to me, let's show the whole game. I said, Rune, we can't, because we were repeating ourselves all the way along. We were taking things out and repeating ourselves. We can only show what we've actually got, which is all new material. We can't go back and show everything because you'd hear the same thing twice in 2 different segments.
Correct. So in other words, then when we watched that game at 8:00 at night that night, we only saw like 8 minutes of the first period?
I'm guessing. No, I said we took maybe 8 minutes out.
So you saw 12 minutes.
Yeah, right. So I'm saying I can't tell you exactly. I don't remember. I'm making up the numbers now. I mean, we're talking a long time ago.
Right.
But we were editing as we went along, expecting that we were going to only show part of the first period, part of the second period, part of the third period. End of story. Americans, nice job. But you didn't win. That didn't happen.
But here's the issue that people don't realize, and I'm learning something.
Yeah.
When we put that on at 8:00 that night, ABC, when we put that game on, we did not get 60 minutes of hockey. That's to make a long story short. We did not get that whole game. No, you did not,
but you rarely were getting that in those days anyway, because remember, in those days, there were no television timeouts. So if we had gone to commercials during you wouldn't have had a full game anyway.
Wow, how about that? I did not realize that.
There were no commercial timeouts.
All right, you
would get a whistle, they'd line up and do another face-off, and there were no timeouts. So
how about
even had we been doing the game live, you would have had X amount of commercials through every period, and we might have missed some of the goals.
I get it. You would have been in trouble there. All right, how about the famous Al line, do you believe in miracles? Give me some thoughts on that for a sec. Go ahead.
Well, look, Al's a classic example, and I used to say this to people that I've talked to, and I'm still talking to some college classes and things, that a lot of times you've got to be in the right place at the right time, but then you got to make the most of it. And that was all Al. Al was in the right place at the right time. I'm thankful that I put him on the event because nobody could have captured it any better. He was perfect with it. And Al did a great job. He deserves all the kudos. Al's still one of the greatest announcers ever. Certainly one of the best announcers today at what he's doing. And he deserves every kudo he's ever gotten for it.
Did you know when you first heard it that this was going to be an iconic line, or did it kind of grow on you after you heard it back on TV 3 or 4 hours later?
I think it was the latter, not the former. I think it was such a classic line, but who knew that it would catch on nationally the way it did? When I first heard it, I just felt, Al, you summed it up perfectly, never figuring that it would become the signature moment.
All right, now the gold medal game was on Sunday morning. Did we? Now that was live.
That was live.
I'm assuming we saw that all 3 periods. I saw the game. Yes. I don't remember. To give me a little rundown on that against Finland. Go ahead.
Well, that was just what you just said. I mean, the bottom line is it was live. It's hard to say a gold medal game was anticlimactic because the Americans had finally won the gold medal. But it was almost anticlimactic after what happened on Friday night. And the fact that the Americans could pull themselves together and stay together and do what they did on Sunday was no less miraculous.
Now, did you create a window for that game on ABC, or is ABC scheduled to go live early Sunday morning?
My recollection is that it was in a time period. Remember, we were doing weekend daytime events, so my recollection is that game was scheduled to be shown.
It was. Okay, now that was, did you have...
There were other events that were probably on at the same time, and the hockey game probably got more attention than it otherwise would have. But, had it been a gold medal game between the Finnish team and the Soviet team, I don't think it would have been covered wall to wall.
No, you wouldn't have shown it at all. Now, did you have to change? Did you have to speak to the International Hockey Committee to get the time at the way you wanted it, or was it scheduled at that time?
That game went as scheduled wherever it was, and I just don't remember where I was anymore, Chris. My recollection is that it was in the early afternoon, and that because it backed everything else up. Because what happened was, and I'll tell you the funny story was, it backed everything up because after the game they had everything scheduled for the ice arena in the same day, which was sort of crazy. Meaning they had the gold medal hockey game that was to be followed by the ceremony for the hockey, that was to be followed by the they always have a skating exhibition of all the champions.
Right.
After the Olympics or after the competitions are over, and then followed by the closing ceremonies. Well, the Americans win the gold medal. Chaos is almost broken out with the medal ceremony. It runs forever. That backs up the skating exhibition. That backs up the closing ceremony. And the IOC was blaming us for backing up, and the figure skating people for backing up the figure skating. We didn't do it. It backed up itself by everything else that happened that day.
Right, exactly. What was the rating astronomical that Friday and Sunday, Dennis, or no?
Yeah, I think the Friday, again, I don't have them handy, Chris. It's a long time ago, but the answer's got to be yes for its time. I mean, ratings are so much different today than they were then. Ratings then would have been astronomical for them. Today it would have been over the moon for the ratings you were getting then. I mean, you've got to remember that in those days you had, Wide World of Sports on Saturday and Sundays on a regular basis in those years were getting 12 to 14 ratings. Now you consider a good rating that gets a 3, 4, or 5.
Right. So you're talking about 25 million people every week watching Wide World of Sports. So you're probably more. So for that Friday night game with word of mouth, as you said, ironically, the fact that we all knew that the United States had won, if you paid attention, probably built the audience. That game probably had 40, 50 million people watching it, right?
I'm sure it did, Chris. Again, I couldn't prove it. I don't have the ratings handy. But I will guarantee you that as a share, the number of sets that were turned into the Olympics had to be about a 60 or 70 share.
All right. In your career, last thing, Dennis Lewin doing a great job here. In your career, which spans, as you said, 30, 40 years of high caliber sports and a variety of them, Monday Night Football, World Series, a whole bit. Is that the greatest moment you've ever had to cover?
Oh, I don't know, Chris. I mean, look, you get jaded a little bit when you're in the business, and people often ask me what's your fondest memory, that's amongst them. I mean, look, it's as I said earlier, it may be the greatest upset in the history of sports, but I've had the privilege of being a part of so many things during my career. I have a hard time separating them out because it's all at the time and at the place. It was fabulous. But when I did the gymnastics, let's say in '76, and Nadia Comaneci was getting 10s, that was incredible. When I did the swimming in '72 and Mark Spitz gets 7 gold medals, that was incredible. I mean, as a single moment, the Olympics might have been it. In '80, I'm talking about, but it's hard to separate what is the most memorable.
But remember, Dennis, too. I'm not calling you. You're on talk shows here this week, 30, and you're going to be on talk shows. God help us, and hopefully in 2 years at the 40th anniversary, they're going to call you. Every talk show host in America is going to on TV. They're going to call you up.
Don't give them my number, Chris.
I won't. But they're going to call you up for the same reason I just did.
That's okay.
And they're not calling you up about Nadia Comaneci, and they're not going to call you up.
I understand. No, I get it. You're just asking me my opinion. And I said, I think it's probably the greatest upset of all time, and it brought tears to everybody's eyes, and I can't remember the last thing that did that. But at the end of the day, I had the privilege of covering people from Muhammad Ali to Super Bowls to World Series, and that was probably the greatest moment. Whether it was the greatest event, beauty's in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah, excellent job, Dan. I learned something today. Keep up the good work. Good to hear from you. Keep up. Good to see you doing well. Thanks very much.
Good talking to you, Chris.
Very good. Dennis Lewin there, who, as you just heard, that whole story on the Olympics in 1980. That was a tremendous job. Well done by Eddie Erickson finding him. Good to have him bulk it up a little bit. Something a little different. Here's Jacob Wilkins with a Sports Bite on Mad Dog.